Hello and welcome back. In today's tutorial, we're going to look at saving our data between scenes. So in the last tutorial, if you recall, when we collected cherries or lost a couple of health points, when you moved into the next scene, it reset, right? So all of our stats reset to kind of what was in the script. So that's not what you want. If you had extra lives that you had earned, or if you collected a bunch of cherries, you want those to continue on throughout the different scenes. So that's what we're going to look at today, constructing or making a relatively simple script to do that. Okay, so before we do the Don't Destroy script, so to get our stats to stay, as you start to develop your levels, we were working with a simplified hierarchy in a sense that we only really had a couple of things there. What happens is as you add, so I added a number of cherries just to create a pattern and then to illustrate this, right? You start to get a cluttered hierarchy. So you might have, 15 cherries, 10 different mushroom enemies, and so on, and then it just gets hard to find them. So what you want to do is you can create, so I've already done this from the last video, but basically you would just create an empty game object, and then we can call this enemies, and then you can parent your thing. So I did this with the cherries. So all of the cherries were kind of scattered here, created an empty game object called cherries, and then moved them all in there. So one thing that you do want to do, you want to reset your, because all of our game objects are set from the origin, we're just going to reset the enemies game object to the origin, and then you can move your enemies down into there. So we can move our mushroom patrol, attach it to the enemies, and we can move the saw there. And what else do we have here? We have the rock. And the rock home, same thing, we can attach that there, and so on. So those are some of the enemies. So now we can kind of shrink that down, and it keeps your hierarchy, and you can organize your game objects, and it makes it easier to find them where they're and so on. So that's that. The one thing you do need to make sure is that because you're moving them, and that's where by setting this to the origin, it keeps your transforms the same. Right, so if you then move it back out of the enemies, it's going to go back to where it should be, essentially. So anyways, so that's that. Just helps to keep that organized. To get the stats to stay, what you want to do, so we're going to create, I'm going to shrink that down. So we're going to create an empty game object. We're going to call this permanent stats. And then in that game object, we're going to add a component. And I had done this, I think I deleted the script though, so that's good. So we're going to create a script, and we're also going to call it permanent stats. Then create and add it. Okay, so in our permanent stats script, we don't need these start functions and that, so I'm just going to delete them. So we are going to, this is where we are going to set our variables that we want to maintain. So we're going to create a public int called current health, and we're going to set it to 3. We're also going to create a public int, and we're going to, for the number of lives, and we'll start with 4 lives. And we're also going to create a public int. So the third int is our number of apples. So we're going to call this number of apples. And we don't want to start with any apples, so we'll set that to 0. And then we also want to create a public static. So a public static permanent stats, which refers to this class. So we're creating basically a static image of what our stats are at the moment, and we're going to call it persist. So persist is going to be the name of the that static image of what our stats currently are. And the reason these need to be public as well, so previously we were serializing field and we wanted them private, it's because we need to be able to access these from the other scripts. So our player script where our health is, or where we're getting hurt, we need to be able to get these values there. Right, so that's why these have to be public, because it's on a completely different game object. So instead of doing on start, we're going to do a void awake, which actually is called before the start. So this is going to be called immediately at the start of the level. So we want to make sure that these don't get destroyed. So it really is just don't destroy on load and then game object. Right? And what that's doing is we're not destroying this game object. So whatever these stats are, so when we load the next scene, so our current health is going to be 3. And then as we add health to it, so we're going to do the same thing. So current health will be 3 plus 1. If we gain hearts or apples will be 2, 3, 4. And then whatever it's stored at that moment, it's going to stay and move into the next scene. So we're not destroying this. And we want to identify if persist, and we really don't need this specifically. However, this does come into effect if you kind of move on and you want to save games or start at different levels, then this becomes important. So if persist equals null, so if there's no, so for example, you might have a game where you can, you have little buttons to level 1, level 2, level 3, and you can start kind of wherever. So if you start at level 4 and the persist equals null, so there is none, then you want to use this as your creation. So in that case, you would have to take this game object and add it into every scene. So anyway, so if persist equals null, then persist equals this. Right, and quite simply, that's all that is. So then this game object is the persist value. Else, we're going to destroy the game object. No, not capital there. So game object. And the reason that is, so again, so we'll save this. So save permanent stats. We'll let it compile. Okay. So now that it's compiled, so we have these values. So now we have these here. And we're going to have to go into our player script and kind of move them out of there as well, and then make reference to these stats. But what I was trying to get at in terms of that, so let's go back to the script just quickly. All right, so if the persist is null, then this is the persist. And the reason you do that is because if you go into scene 2 and this game object is in every scene, which it should be if you have it where you can load from different scenes, then what's going to happen is, right, you don't want to have multiple copies of this, right? You don't want to have 3 or 4 different copies and it won't know, well, which stats are we using, right? So it just makes sure that you're destroying one and there's only going to be one game object called permanent stats. So even though you have one here, it doesn't destroy when we go into the next level. It's going to be there and so on. And we'll look at that in a second. So for now, though, that's it. So that's good. So what we want to do now is make reference. So we need to go to our player script. So we're going to edit the player script. And I'm just going to comment these out. You can delete these. But just for now, I'm just going to comment them out. So we're not using our current health. And we're not using our number of lives variables here. All right, so we're going to be using the permanent stats values there. And then in terms of the text values, so these texts stay the same because these are making reference to the text in the UI. But in terms of these values, we don't use them. So what you want to do then is go down and try to find all of the values that, or all of the spots to make reference to those current health and the number of lives. So if you scroll down, so here, so the first spot is, so with our void health, so our current health, so the way we had it before was it was taking our current health from this script and minusing equal 1. So what you do here is you are going to get the permanent stats dot current health minus equals 1. I believe I called it current health. Yeah, so we kept it the same. So it's just permanent stats dot current health minus equals 1. So what it's doing is it's going to go to the script and minus 1 health from this. So now you would have 2 health. And then similarly, we want to do the same for permanent stats or for the number of lives. So permanent stats Okay, so permanent stats dot number of lives, and then here we want permanent stats dot number of lives, and I'm actually going to copy that. And I think that's everywhere. So we'll save this out. I know I'm probably missing a few spots, but that's fine, because this will kind of illustrate the things that. So this, all these references are partially because of the, like these ones here, the current health does not exist. So 48, 49. So line, so I must have it way up here as well. So line 48, oh, that's right, because so where we're referencing our text, we want this to be our, so we want this to be our permanent stats, and then our permanent stats, number of lives. And I thought there was one more way down here, so same thing, so this should be our, oh, that's not what I wanted. Permanent stats, and save that out. So we still have errors on, so 48, 49, 51. So 51 and 151 are easy fixes. So 51, 151, so this should be permanent stats. Dot current health. And up on 51, our number of lives, which should be our permanent stats dot number of lives. So getting reference to those. And then all right, sorry, I know where my error was. So sorry, so this should be, sorry, so permanent stats. So that's getting our permanent, so it's kind of referencing this. But then we want our, so the game object, so the persist values as well, right? So it's getting our script, and then we want the persist. So this should be permanent stats dot persist dot current health, permanent stats dot persist dot number of lives. We'll go down, fix all of those where we had permanent stats. So permanent stats dot persist. Permanent stats dot persist. Permanent stats dot persist. Permanent stats. And this should be our parent. That should also be permanent. You know what? I'm just going to copy this because that makes the most sense. That should be not plural, so oh, why did it duplicate that? So copy this, control copy, control paste. So with permanent stats dot persist current health, permanent stats dot persist dot number of lives, and then down here dot persist. And now we'll save it. And now hopefully most of these errors will be gone. Okay, awesome. So we got them all fixed. I did actually still have a few errors there that I fixed, but you don't need to watch me go through, right? So those errors are all, again, make sure that it's, I had a couple of just spelling things as well. So I had it, this for example was persist. So just go in and make sure it's permanent stats dot persist. Again, depending on what you named it. So if you could name this something else. Same thing, you could, instead of calling this persist, you might name it, in other tutorials you might call it called instance or other things as well. So anyway, so that's that. And again, I apologize. You know, I forgot. And again, this is one of those things where as you work through this, right, it's about finding where you're making those errors and then just fixing them, right? So troubleshooting. So it took me a second to remember, oh yes, I got to do the permanent stats and then get the persist values. So anyway, so that's that. I'll just save that out just to make sure everything should be good. And while we are here, before we play it and try it out, we're going to go in and edit the item collector, which is where we have our, so again, I'm going to comment this out. You can delete it because you're not going to need it. And then the same thing here, we want this as permanent stats dot persist dot number of cherries, and just double check. No, I want cherries. So we'll change that in our permanent stat script. Again, make sure you save that or else it's not going to recognize it. So because we're using cherries, and again, when I've done this before, I was using apples. That's why I had apples there. So in our item collector, so permanent stats dot persist dot number of cherries, and then our permanent stats dot persist number of, so num cherries plus plus, which is going to add 1 to our number of cherries. And that's good. So that's all. So that should keep our 3 stats. So we'll save that. Okay, so if we go in and play our game, so collect the cherry. Let's lose a couple of lives maybe. So so now we have 2 lives, 1 heart. We'll just collect that, and again, right, everything else works, so continue. So right now we have 4 cherries, 1 heart, 2 lives. So when we finish, go to the next level, we should have 4, 1, 2. So perfect, that's what we want, right? So now our stats are maintained through the levels. So as you keep moving through your levels, your stats are going to be there, and it's not going to reset back to no cherries and so on, right? Back to your full hearts and so on. So anyway, so that's perfect. Everything works great. So that's it for this tutorial. So that's one method that you can use to move stats in new scenes. There are other methods. This is the one that I'm comfortable with and I like, and there's pros and cons to both, and depending on which article you might read about the differences between ways to do this, different people have different opinions. So anyway, so that's perfect. That's great. So in the last tutorial, and there's actually a couple more tutorials that we're going to look at. One, we're going to add sounds, and then we're also going to look at changing the camera to improve the camera views and so on. And that's it. So take care, and I'll see you in the next video.